This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com. This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com. This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.
Made the old recordings different. Reason that this kind of became a thing in my life is really the people I grew up with, the people who were my teachers. A wonderful friend of mine, Italo Babini, was kind of a mentor to me and got me hooked on recordings of Heifetz and of Fauré when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. So I grew up kind of hearing that as the norm, which was kind of unusual for a cellist of my generation, and it changed my outlook on music in a certain way and gave me a certain kind of orientation. And I mean, I'm not here today to talk about what I think is better or worse or try to make an argument for values, because I think that those things are very personal and you have to figure it out for yourself. What I am here to make an argument for today is the idea that it's different, that it is really significantly different. The way music was played in the first half of the 20th century, say maybe up till there was a kind of a gradual transition through the 1960s and 70s, but the way music was played then and the way music is played now is different. The approach to music, the priorities, the values were all different, and we have the incredible fortune to actually have the ability to compare of all this, to kind of see all this and talk about what's different. And I have a few video clips. I've tried to focus on pianists and violinists more than cellists, because I know it gets so controversial when we talk about cellists, because you think we're saying something about a particular cellist, and it's not that. I mean, these are generational trends, and of course there are exceptions. There are people who play kind of, I mean, for instance, just to look at a conductor, I mean, Stokowski in a lot of ways was a very modern conductor in the way he was very personalized and kind of in his interpretations, and kind of, you know, where someone like Reiner was very kind of straightforward, or Zell was kind of a purist. I mean, even Toscanini, I mean, Stokowski was kind of very much in the modern style. So it's not, look, these are not hard and fast rules, but these are just some of the things that we can learn. And I think what's important ultimately is that we understand what we're doing. It's my mother has a saying, probably a lot of people's mothers have a saying, that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And if we don't think about what we want to do, if we don't understand phrasing, I mean, playing the cello well is hard, but as an end unto itself, it's also kind of stupid. There's easier ways to make music. There's not just being a good cellist for the sake of being a good cellist. What does it mean? What is the point? If the point of playing the cello is to make music, that's something, it's to make it such a part of you that the music becomes kind of natural. But it doesn't happen by accident. You can't imagine that you're just going to feel something and it's going to come out beautiful. You can feel it beautifully inside, but creating it beautifully on the instrument is a craft. We have to learn, and honestly, to understand how the music is constructed, to understand how to phrase, is also just like you have to learn to speak a language. You can feel it, but to express it is something else. And look, this is the work of a lifetime. This is the work of several lifetimes. But let me start off by sharing a recording of, well, two piano recordings. One is a modern, very famous, very accomplished and successful modern pianist, and I'm not trying to throw any shade on her. The other is a pianist that grew up studying with Clara Schumann and playing for Brahms. In fact, Brahms dedicated some of his last pieces to her, just to get a little idea of what's different. All right, so we're going into the exciting world of screen sharing. Let me see if I can do this correctly. I've got to find the right Here we go. Okay. First recording. Sense of this now, Lorna. Not that there's anything wrong with the first recording, but it's hard not to argue that those recordings are from completely different worlds. This is a completely different approach to music. The first felt, I didn't feel unmusical. When we listened to the first recording, it didn't feel like it lacked rubato, but then you listen to Ilona Ivanschutz, and the rubato is so much more. The tempo, of course, you immediately notice is faster, but it's also slower. It's moving forward, and then it's pulling back. It's all over the place. The tempo is, because the tempo was not, it was all dictated by push and pull going with the melody. The whole idea that we move forwards and backwards, and that this kind of freedom, and this is why when they asked Brahms about putting metronome markings in his pieces, he almost never did, because he said, what's the point? The tempo is not the same in the second and third measure. Now you kind of understand a little bit of what that world is. It's freedom. It's freedom, but it's not just random freedom. There's always an idea that's always moving through little notes, going to the goal of the phrase, pulling back to expand. And so there's this almost kind of organic breathing that kind of happens. Very, very different. I mean, if you play like that today, you'd be told like, oh, well, you need to put on a metronome. You need to, how's anybody going to play with you? This was the idea of what their idea was: beauty first, music first. So one of the things we're going to talk about, of course, is tempos. Tempos used to be broadly, generally, faster. We have slowed down over time. Particularly, we have slowed down in the slower music. If you listen, for example, to Richard Strauss conducting his Heldenleben, I think it's about 35 minutes long. Average modern performance is 45 to 50 minutes. You see this broadly everywhere. I mean, Feuermann and Casals, the recording of the Dvorak Concerto was, I think, on the order of like 42 minutes. No, maybe it's 37. In any case, it's about 5 to 7 minutes shorter than a modern Dvorak recording, most of them. And it's not faster, isn't necessarily a better value, but faster when you play faster, it changes your perception of the line. If I play something, I should play instead of singing. I don't know what'll come out when I play, but I know it'll be worse when I sing. But you get note by note. You get, just like as you walk or you drive, you see a different view of the landscape. You get a different perspective. When you go faster, you get a different perspective of tempo, of the music, of the phrase. You can just, and actually you could just play with this with the exact same recording on YouTube. I didn't think to do this, but we do this sometimes in my class. We take the exact same performance and speed it up to 1.25, slow it down to 0.75, and look how your ear perceives, look how the phrase hits your ear differently. Your perception changes. So tempos were generally faster in this era, but with much, much, much more rubato, much more the idea that you change the tempo, that you push and pull, and it's all dictated by the melody. You notice the other thing you notice with Yuja versus Ilona is how you just kind of very even between the two hands. And with Ilona, it was almost all melody driven. The accompaniment was there, but you were barely aware of it. It was all of the drive was coming from the melody. The other thing you'll find, and we talk about sometimes, is the sense of agogic accents, particularly in rhythmic passages. This is something it took me years to understand. The idea that rhythm is not about playing with a metronome. Playing with a metronome is a great practice tool. It's not going to make you, I used to, when I studied my teacher Nelsova, and I used to go in for her and say, "Sweetie, you're not playing in rhythm." And I didn't understand because I felt like I could play completely. I was like, I practiced with a metronome. How could I not be in rhythm? But there's a difference between projecting a sense of pulse and between just playing with a metronome and just kind of being like, and you can project a sense of pulse and feel very metronomic even as you move the rhythm around, because you bring the audience with you. You're like, that's kind of like the drummer in a band. That brings you that sense of pulse. These what I call the agogic accents rhythmically. And of course, when you get into, we have different things. When we're singing, when we're a melodist, you don't want it to be like this, but there are times when we're kind of rhythm. Yum, you need those agogic accents. And this is something that was given quite a bit. In fact, Heifetz was kind of a master of this. If you slow down a fast kind of third movement, one of these moto perpetual third movements of Heifetz, slow it down or just focus in and really listen to how hard he crushes the accents in the measure. And it's not about the fact that it's metronomic. It's not. If you put a metronome to it, it's going to be all over the place. But he crushes those accents and you feel it. And it just, you get it, the rhythm grabs you in kind of an incredible way. And then we're talking about rubato. And then we're talking about, what the point of art is the art is made in how you break the rules. But if you don't establish the rules first, if you don't establish the feeling of rhythm, then it doesn't mean anything when you take time away from it. It doesn't, how we don't understand that you're pulling away. But one of the things you notice kind of in those recordings is how Ilona moves through the small notes. She doesn't make a big deal of the little notes. And the left hand and the right hand, the melody and the accompaniment don't line up. You'll see this all the time. For instance, you look at recordings from Feuermann or Chrysler or even Casals of some of these little pieces, these kind of what the Heifetz used to call itsy bitsies, these little 3-minute salon pieces. The idea that you would line up with the piano, even on sonatas, the idea that the melody and that the melody and the accompaniment have to line up is a very modern age idea. And it's actually contrary to the way they were taught to make music during the time of the well, I was going to say the time of the great composers, which somebody could argue with, but let's just say the time of the great romantic composers, you know, which is a lot of the music we play as cellists. The time this music was written was very much about rubato, about melody and accompaniment not lining up, and it has kind of great musical meaning when that happens. It's not interesting really to just where everything, there's no value to, I mean, nobody goes to a recital to say like, oh my gosh, they lined up so well, it was so beautiful. That's not how music works. So the idea, and in fact, the typical kind of thing in Brahms' era, you push to the top of the phrase. You push through the small notes to the top of the phrase, and then you kind of pull back. There's, again, this breathing in and out, this kind of really, this kind of movement through the phrase, and when you do that, you bring us with you. If it becomes all notey, you know, and a lot of what we do in modern times is kind of more notes for effect. I'm trying to think, I should have thought of a better passage to demonstrate, but let me see if I can do this. Yeah, I mean, you could do little beautiful things on each note, but if it becomes, and you have to, of course, have beautiful things, but if it becomes too much, then it's like a little bit of a room that's decorated with 100 different beautiful paintings, but the whole effect is just chaos. You lose the big picture. So let's talk about another issue. Vibrato, and of course this is, now we get into kind of a controversial area, because if you're talking, you know, historically, yes, they use vibrato differently in the time, but we're not historical reenactors, okay? And as I'm trying to explain to you what the people of a certain era did differently, but that doesn't make it a good in and of itself. The fact that maybe Joachim didn't use that much vibrato does not make it in and of itself a good for modern day people. The fact that Heifetz did a certain way doesn't necessarily make it a good value for you. You have to figure this out, but we have to understand for sure. However, having said that, it's not really as cut and dried as that. First of all, there was a lot of individual variation. There are certainly reports of, there are certain people that did use vibrato. For instance, at least in one case, Popper was written up for use. Critics said, you know, he's unnerved by the Popper's use of vibrato on every note. There's the quartet that played for Brahms all the time, and the violinist, of course, was recorded in the modern era using quite a bit of vibrato. And the other thing is, if you listen to how the kind of the earliest recordings, the kind of non-vibrato recordings, they're not kind of the vegetarian kind of, it's not that kind of, it's, there's just the slightest, if you listen carefully, there's just the slightest wiggle of the fingers, so it's creating it's not. And there's a whole world of difference between a tiny smut, because to them, you know, when they were saying no vibrato, it's, you know, it's not this kind of thing. Okay, now, you have to be very careful when your sources are all written, because the first real sources we have are recordings. That's the first thing to trust, because if you look at the people, for instance, who made the earliest recordings, what they write and what they say are often different. And take, for example, Leopold Auer, who says in his violin teaching book, he says vibrato is a disease. But look at his most famous pupils. Look at Jascha Heifetz, Nathan Milstein, Tosha Seidel. All of these players were, I mean, they were the kind of revolution in vibrato. So, look, you have to choose what is most beautiful. But I'm going to tell you, you know, you figure out what works for you in 2022 to make beauty, because that is the rule. We're not historical reenactors. That said, I lose my mind when people talk about vibrato like, putting vibrato on every note is like putting ketchup on your entire. I mean, that would be true if and only if you have only one kind of vibrato. If everything is yes, then if you're going to play the cello that way, then please don't. First of all, but then I guess the only option you would have is to not vibrate. But vibrato is not ketchup. Vibrato is flavor. Vibrato is one of the most expressive and artistic things we control doing the cello, and I mean the great players understand that. Vibrato should not stay the same through a note. Listen to the great singers, first of all, as a guide for vibrato. Listen to the great string players. I mean, but vibrato moves through a note. A couple of things I teach. I usually teach, vibrato starts wide. Well, okay, let me give you the other examples. If vibrato starts narrow and stays narrow, you get... Sometimes you want that sound. If vibrato starts wide and goes to narrow... often helps to start the ring of the instrument. What usually doesn't work, unless you're trying to do it for a special effect, is narrow to wide. Or what is now somehow become an artistic device of... I saw a recording the other day of... it's... David Sawyer used to say, it's okay for Ella Fitzgerald to do once in a while. It doesn't really fit in. But what it is you create a crescendo when you do this. This is why Broadway singers do this when they're at the end of a phrase, when they're... and they go big and wide and they make a crescendo. But please deploy that in a limited way. It's not something you will ever hear, or almost never, and players of what we fetishists call the golden age. It's because what you are doing in the line is making a crescendo on a particular note. Well, if you mean to make a crescendo on that particular note, great. But if it becomes... then you lose the line, you lose the connection, you lose the... This has to stay. And now, again, I would suggest you not stay wide all the way, because then it's... So there's a little... Foreman used to talk about the little bit of a sizzle to the beginning of the vibrato. And of course, look, variety, building variety in color of vibrato, but one of the interesting things I got studying the recordings of Feuermann was how much quicker he started his vibrato at the beginnings of notes, and how it, Casals was kind of, and Feuermann was, and it's a difference in the way the sound blooms. It's a way and interestingly, it's because Feuermann started his career, and of course he died at age 39, when just as he was kind of establishing himself as the next generation. He would have been the next Casals. He would have been the name that everybody knew, and it would have had a huge influence on cello playing. Unfortunately, we lost him before he could accomplish that. But if you look at his earliest recordings made when he was 19, going through the recordings he made at 39, his playing changed and his vibrato changed, actually. He actually got, whereas most people get a kind of wider vibrato as we age, Feuermann actually, his vibrato between 20 and 39 tightened up. Maybe because he was under the influence of, started playing with Heifetz in the last few years. I'm not sure. It became kind of a more intense, more kind of sizzly. But as I was saying, then you get kind of later into the 1960s, you kind of get, I mean, to the point where there's very accomplished modern players, but you'll hear some people play. It creates an effect on a note, but again, each thing you put on an individual note, you lose something from the long picture. So it has to be about balance. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say about vibrato. Delayed note vibrato, yeah. Well, actually, there's an interesting quote from Eric Friedman, who was one of Heifetz's great disciples, who talked about the invention of vibrato really coming. He said it was not about the sound, or at least it was. He said put it in a very interesting way. He said vibrato is to protect the bow and to help projection. It was so that you didn't have to do everything simply with the bow, but that it helped the sound to kind of resonate. But beautiful sound was always the idea. Beautiful sound was the goal. It was not that obviously if somebody can't hear you, then you have a problem. But this kind of obsession with who's got the biggest sound it's kind of a modern phenomenon, and it's kind of silly, because if you want that, play the trombone. This is not, if you want to cut through an orchestra, play a piccolo or a trumpet. Cello is about beautiful sound, and it's about making it heard. That said, I'll tell you, I asked, I think it was David Sawyer, but it was Bernard Greenhouse. So, I asked him, did Feuermann have a big sound? And his answer was interesting. He said it was big enough, you could hear him, and it drew you in. It was not, so, sound is not, the idea that a big but not beautiful sound is kind of like having lots of not very good food. What's the point? At least to me, again. But there's something about the focus, the intensity the vibrato gives that helps it cut. I'll tell at one point also, having said that, don't think that sounding beautiful at the operator's seat of the cello that's not the goal. No, because it's very easy to play on the fingerboard and make something that sounds beautiful to you, and it won't project at all. And of course, cello works by, the strongest person in the world playing at the fingerboard will not make the same sound as a 90-pound person playing at the bridge. The cello works by playing at the bridge, and part of that is going to create some grit in the sound. You can hear that in a lot of like the Heifetz stereo recordings, because he liked to mic very close, so you kind of hear this. In fact, Laszlo Varga told me a story about he was very excited for Heifetz to come play with the New York Phil, because he'd never, he'd been waiting to hear Heifetz live his entire life, and people talk about how different it was, how the Heifetz live experience. They said, as great as the recordings are, they're just a fraction of what you got live. Anyway, so Laszlo was very excited, and then Heifetz came, and he said all he heard was scratch, scratch, scratch. Very, very close. All he heard was scratching. And he said, what is this? Is there something wrong with him? And then he went out into the hall, and he said it was the most glorious, beautiful sound. And it just, it sent shivers up your spine with how beautiful it was. So, beauty of sound, but for the audience, not for you. You may have to get dirty. And we'll get to some questions in a second. I'm going to get through my little spiel here, if that's okay, and then I'll try and spend the second half answering questions. Let's talk about connected bow for a second. This is something I've been working on in my own playing recently, for the last decade or so. But it's a very common modern habit to, let me do it better. before the changes, to lighten up before the changes. And it makes what we call phrasing by the bow. You know? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you hear this so much. And I think one of the reasons I'm kind of in this crazy gut string experiment that's been going on for almost a year now is because I want to understand most of the players whose playing I respond to the most didn't necessarily play on gut strings, but they learned on gut strings. And there is a different activation energy that a gut string requires. And I think it forces you to play a little harder. But this kind of falling away robs you of the long line. You know, we're always talking about trying to build the long line, trying to go somewhere. And so what I've been trying to teach myself to do is not just pressure, but what we do is often that we slow down the bow. So it goes, you know, fast and it slows. So we speed up in the middle of the bow, we slow down at the ends, and that kills, that makes the hole in the sound. So trying to learn to come. Takes, of course, a lot of coordination with the left hand too, but the idea that you're going fast, don't let it. I have to think going fast on the new bow, and usually that does enough to stop me from slowing on the old bow, but this helps you to create legato through the bow changes. You know, we talk about all this kind of hand stuff. Okay, you know, if it works for you, great. This is not religion, you know, let's be pragmatic. Whatever works to create a good long line through the bow change, great. I will say that if you watch Casals and Feuermann and Nelsova and some of the great players, there's not a lot of this stuff going on. They really just look like, I mean, look at Heifetz, look at Chrysler, look at the way they change the bow. So I think it would be hard to argue that it's absolutely necessary. Again, think of the goal, find a way to get there. But this is really something that's vital. Again, if you want to create a long line, if you want to create motion, if you want to create the bigger picture, you can't be interrupting the sound every time you make a bow change. You can't be dying off and then coming back and dying off and coming back. They used to call the Wechseln. Let me share some more videos just to show you a little bit. All right. Again, I'm trying to focus on violinists, but I've tried to pick very different, like contrasting violinists from the modern era, just so that you understand that it's the broader differences and not just the differences between players, which of course there are a lot. For stopping mid-phrase, but I'm going to keep moving. different performances. It would be easy to go into the differences between them, but they exist in a different, both of them together exist in a different universe from this. Notice the sense of pulling back, the big changes of tempo. It's almost as if, I mean, to me, it's almost the idea of an actor on the stage who kind of takes the words and not just kind of reading them, but just making something entirely his own. Well, of course, in this case, the piece was his own, but the sense of kind of freedom, the sense of moving forward through certain notes. Listen one more time. Listen to how you hear the long phrase. And just to compare, not to pick on Janine, who's a wonderful violinist, but for me, I get more notes. I hear dum pam pam dun dun dun. Chrysler, even though he's very disjointed, has already in his head the directions he's going. It's a different way now. It's not. I mean, it's mean to do this because to compare anybody to Chrysler, we all ain't none of us Chrysler. So this is, but it is something to keep in mind, and this is all available for you. This is all there. You're the first generation in history to have all this at your fingertips, and yet I know when you're young, all you think about is, am I going to be? How do I rank up among my peers? How's my career? How's all this? And am I going to get a job? Am I going to? If you're going to spend your life in music, spend your life thinking about music. Spend your life as a musician. Spend your life trying to get better, because I promise you 3 lifetimes is not enough to get close. Every progress that I've made in my life has just made it clear to me. It's like getting up to the top of a mountain and you see there's 3 more mountain ranges ahead of you. It's a fantastic way to spend your life if you spend it really in the pursuit of music and trying to the pursuit of better phrasing. But if you're just talking about playing the cello well or just career success, I mean, those things, they're ephemeral and they come and they go. One other thing I want to talk about, actually 2 other things. One thing I understand a lot more these days is that composers wrote to the long notes. The important parts of the phrase were usually the long notes, say like 90-95% of the time. We as players tend to emphasize the moving notes because that's where the mechanics take place. And often this is particularly what will happen is you won't hold a note because you're worried about what comes next. So it's kind of hard to keep picking up and putting on the cello, but people are, I mean, how many times do we hear that? But there's something happening on it. There's something happening. Those are not important. Those are not important. Those are the kind of things the old players would have gone through. but because we tend to die off and if we let go of this note, then that sounds like an accent. If you sustain, already it's not going to sound, it's not going to pop out so much. What's another good example of this? Oh yeah, Haydn. You often hear same thing. He writes a suspension. The most important part is actually the end of the note over there, and then it won't sound so notey. It won't sound. That you have direction, that you have a goal. Now, it's not to say there's only one way to play a phrase. There are hundreds of ways to execute a phrase beautifully. There's hundreds of ways to write a book that are beautiful and poignant, to tell a story. There's 100 ways or hundreds of ways to paint a painting. That doesn't mean that every way you do it is good. There are thousands of bad ways to phrase too, and there is not one correct way, but all incorrect ways are kind of incorrect in the same ways with the same ideas. One other thing we'll talk about, and then I'll just leave a little time for questions, but is glissandi, which is, if you listen to the old school recordings, kind of the pre-Casals, you hear sometimes there's a lot of, especially they used, they considered it part of creating, but sometimes very heavy glissandi. Casals, part of his revolution was kind of moving cello playing away from that. So compared to the people who came before him, Casals and Feuermann thought they were kind of much less schmaltzy. They thought they were much more modern players, but now we compare them to the players today, it seems like they slide a lot. David Sawyer told me a story once that he asked Feuermann, why do you slide so much? And Feuermann said, well, the cello is a voice. It's, you sing, you connect the notes just like a singer would. It's not a clarinet where you just cover the holes. This is part of singing. But what I want to talk about is the difference of how they shifted. Is mostly what you hear is the upper part of the shift. If I emphasize the lower part of the shift, I go. If you put too much of the lower part in, then the shift becomes the emphasis instead of emphasizing the note. Now, coming backwards, it's the opposite. You want to not this part. Otherwise, it sounds like a car going by on the freeway, what I call Doppler shifts, or the one I've never understood in the. That's not where the music is, and there's nowadays often when people do a shift, they try to put the music into the glissando. The glissando is something that emphasizes, that connects, that emphasizes the notes, but it's not kind of an effect. It's not like, hey, look, I'm doing it. Yeah, I mean, at least in this style of playing, which I'm talking about, in the way they did it, take this information and go with it where you want. There was also, in that time, I think, many of these players had a great understanding of the full score. Auer required all his students had to be able to play the piano, and they accompanied each other. So most of these people could play the piano accompaniments to all these pieces by heart. They had the whole thing memorized. Heifetz always made his students play from the piano score so that they understood what was going on. And I was certainly guilty of this, have the habit to practice from just the cello part, and you get this kind of periscope idea, like seeing the world just through the cello part. You're always thinking about how to make the cello part important, but sometimes it's not important. Sometimes it's about the much better music is made when you have a conversation, when you know that, oh, I'm getting out of the way here, I'm getting into the way. So, I mean, it's common sense, but common sense is rare. It took me a long time to develop any common sense. So try to understand the full score. In general, I mean, I'll play you one more set of examples, but I say in general, the change is seeking more drama on particular notes. And if in contrast, the older playing will often seem kind of simpler, even though it's much freer and there's much greater flexibility. And in the older style, melody tends to dominate. Sometimes there are technical habits that create a lot of our phrasing, and you have to understand that feeling the phrase, we all feel music inside, that's why we decided to play the cello, but feeling it inside, Michelangelo can't go and feel you a statue. You know, you don't go to watch how much Michelangelo feels the creation of a statue. You don't go to watch a painter feel something. It's about what we create, and if you don't create, feeling it is only the first step towards creating it. It's not enough to, and of course, you know, not being physically involved does not mean one thing or another. I find if I can stop myself from moving more, I tend to listen better. I can focus better on what I'm playing. So I'm trying to keep myself from, you know, from doing all this stuff, because the more I act out physically, the more I distract myself and don't listen and therefore can't adjust to actually create something beautiful. So that's what I struggle with. That said, I mean, just because somebody sits still doesn't make them a great musician. You know, there are players who sit very still who break the phrases, and there are players like Heifetz who sit still and it's just the center of a firestorm. It's something amazing. We have come an incredibly long way technically on the cello, but if we spend all our time thinking about that, if that's how we compare everything, if that's our standard, that's what we're going to get. You know, we will fill the void of what we're looking for, and if what we're looking for is to have 20 cellists who can play Paganini 24 on the cello, and sorry for my part in that, but if that's what we're looking for, that's what we'll create. But think about what you want to create, why you want to do it. So I'm going to do finally just one more, finally go to a cello example, and then maybe take a few minutes for questions. Let me remember how to do this again. Okay. Second theme of Dvorak. Make sure I've got them in the right way. Again, nothing against these cellists who are all nice people and friends. I wouldn't want to be in this comparison myself either. Someone who I think is pretty different cellist. Casals, very different from Fauré, but the two have much in common compared to the two different modern. So much more freedom with the rhythm. You notice the faster tempos immediately, but then how much they change, how much they bend the rhythm, how rhapsodic it is in a way. So very free, but it also, how they push through certain notes, how they push through certain notes to emphasize others, so it becomes a kind of a broader, in a way, a little bit simpler. There's a very good, last video I'll play today, but there's a YouTube of the source is Early Music Sources is the name of the uploader, and they do a lot of interesting things, but there's a historical recordings from the beginning of the 20th century video that I would really recommend you all watch. They did a lot of great research, but I'm just going to play their summary from the examples they have, because and I would encourage you to all seek out this video.
Is a very broad field. It is therefore clear that the points brought up here are rough generalizations. Tempo. The tempo tends to be more flexible and often changes throughout the piece. Also, in many cases, the basic tempo is simply faster. Melody. The rhythms of the melodies are often slightly altered. Series of notes can be played with a little inégalité, for example. In modern practices, there is a more literal interpretation of note values. Melody versus accompaniment. The melody and the accompaniment are often not well synchronized. The melody is arriving very often after or before the beat of the accompaniment. Portamenti and glissandi. In recordings of singers and string players, one can hear a great deal of portamenti and glissandi. Vibrato. The vibrato of singers and instrumentalists is more varied than in modern practices, and there is also the possibility of not using vibrato at all. Ornaments and passaggi. In many recordings, one can hear ornaments and passaggi that are not written in the music. Check our special page for some nice examples of that.
Now, so I'd encourage all of you to check out that video in its entirety. There's a lot of great information, a lot of great things there. Let me see if I can answer a couple of questions on all of this. Again, I'm not, but I will say with that, it's up to you to figure out your voice and how you want to speak. But what is not okay is to not think about it. We have a duty, and you have this, to be able to do this side by side in YouTube. I mean, what we would have given in my generation to have this, and you have to think about this. You have to think, you have to figure out what kind of player you want to be, and you have to be able to answer why you do things. So let me run to the chat and see what we've got going. Okay, so first question is, what's the difference between agogic and rubato? Agogic is actually a certain clarification of the beats. It's just, for instance, in the Dvorak, that second theme we're just playing, God, I just should not play that right after Fauré, but so we have that happened. Here, this is the downbeat. And when it finally comes to this, now it's shifted, and I don't want to play. That would be putting an agogic on the A, but that would be putting the agogic on the F sharp. But that's kind of independent of the sense of rubato. The sense of rubato is whether they do it. I move through those notes? Do I have what they call inégalité, the sense of motion through certain notes, and of course the freedom to change the tempo? So I hope that kind of answers that. It's okay. So this is a question from Sammy Kong, who says, you know, so is it generally the old school reserves rubato for the apex of a phrase, the modern style. I don't think it's that so much as the overall concept of direction. It's, if I'm thinking about beautiful notes, if I'm thinking about, you know, oh, miracle, miracle, miracle. Well, you know, that I always say, I'm sorry, I'm being a jerk, but you know, I always say that, you know, if everybody gets a trophy, then a trophy is meaningless. If every note is special, then no note is special. So yes, kind of in a way, what you're saying is true, but I think it's because they're thinking of direction, because they're thinking of where they're going. And so there are notes that are moved through that are less important. And so there's more rubato everywhere, actually, but there's also, it's like if I speak a sentence and I'm in love with every word, or, you know, I speak a sentence and I'm in love with every word. You know, I have two goals, or you know, the kind of Shatner-esque thing. I hope that makes some sense. I think the bow in the left hand we kind of talked about the not kind of dying away at the bow changes, and the starting the vibrato, you know, the difference between, and it comes with part of the same thing, you know, like, oh, I found the note, now I'm going to vibrate. I promise you, if you practice starting the vibrato right at the beginning of the note, it will actually, if you're vibrating right at the beginning of the note, then you will, not only will it sound better, but physically it's better. The kind of like, oh, I got it, okay, now I'll relax, is actually very uncomfortable. Good. This is an interesting comment, but I don't think it's a question, so I'm not gonna, some interesting stuff. This is a great one about, you know, what kind of listening activities, what kind of advice would I give to younger players? Just start by exploring. I mean, talk to people who are into this kind of thing and just listen, but also the kind of comparison listening. You know, look, I grew up in the world of idolizing. You know, I grew up as the 12-year-old geek riding around listening to Heifetz nonstop. And so that kind of formed my opinions, and I would have formed into a different kind of player if I'd grown up listening to someone else. But what I would suggest is you have to sample everything. And you have to understand, it's not enough to say, I like this. You know, this is what I see always with my students. It's like, I like this recording. Well, you know what? We all have recordings that we like and that we love. And the more we play them, the less we become aware of the details. And the more it just becomes like, you know, like a meal that you've eaten many times, and it's kind of becomes like comfort food. Like, oh, I want to, you know. So we stop recognizing the details. And we have to often, even myself, when I'm doing this stuff with my class, I'm very surprised. I learn new things, playing recordings back to back, comparing, but know the names. For the love of God, no Casals, no Fauré. And by the way, about Casals, you know, a lot of young people think because Casals lived for a very long time and he stopped performing in public at the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. So he stopped, you know, Casals' first recording, the earliest recordings from the 1919s, he was already a fairly old man when he made those. So many of Casals' later recordings are not of the same technical standard that you see today. And so people listen to one thing of Casals and it doesn't sound good, so they think like, oh, well, Casals suck, people play much better today. Listen to Casals from the 1919s, from the early 1920s, fantastic cellist. And I'm not just talking about a fantastic musician, because even the people who idolized Fauré said Casals was on a plane by himself as a musician, but a fantastic cellist. Intonation, command of the instrument, everything was amazing. And don't be put off go seek out Casals' early recordings because he was a fantastic, beautiful player. There are so many. Listen to pianists, listen to singers, listen to conductors, listen to everything that's out there. Listen to modern, listen to olds too. Listen to the names. I mean, there's so many names, I don't even know where to start guiding you. Listen to Rachmaninoff as a pianist, for sure. Know Toscanini, whether you like it or not. Know Toscanini, know that world. Know Heifetz. I mean, the violinists, you could, Heifetz, Milstein, Oistrakh, I mean, Chrysler. You know, I understand people who don't like Heifetz, but if you don't like Chrysler, so we can't be friends. So there is so much. Okay. So it's an interesting question how this works in chamber music, and which is could be subtitled why only certain people want to play chamber music with me. I believe this kind of freedom carries over into chamber music. There is a valid and thoughtful point of view that, you know, chamber music is about lining up, and so I mean, you have to find like-minded people, because if somebody's like, you know, hey, your melody's not quite lining up with the rhythm here, and you know, then you're not going for the same thing. And of course, tempos are always, you know, this choice of tempo is one of the most important decisions we make as a musician. One of the things that most profoundly affect and I'm not talking about overall tempo only, but how we phrase, how we choose a tempo for a particular phrase. So that's very important, and it's kind of, you have to, but to me, this playing works in music, period. In orchestral music and chamber music, this is what I love. Okay, we're talking about that, the glissando from the B to the E in the Elgar Concerto. Is it necessary or is it subjective? Well, okay, again, two sources we have. 2 recordings Elgar made with Beatrice Harrison, one shortly after the concerto, one abbreviated, and the score. What's the score say? Going from memory, but what it says is this upbeat. That's ba-da, aha, that's what's in the music. Ba-da, yum. It's a little heartbeat. And if I do, I've drawn the emphasis away from that. I've robbed that of its meaning. Instead, the slide becomes the thing. So, I mean, which isn't to say it has to be, no, I mean, what is most important in the music? What makes sense for the music? Ta-da, ta-da, kind of that gesture that's in the music. That's what he wrote, and you can do something else, but you're not going to convince me that I mean, you're drawing the emphasis. Our job as musicians, you know, the compositions are written. We kind of show people what our job is, to make the composition come to life in the most pure way, in a kind of clear way, and that requires understanding the language, understanding of the score. What is in there? Why did he write this? If he'd written it a different way, how would it sound if he wrote? We were talking about this in class the other day. Like, you know, okay, in the poco forte marking in Brahms 2, why did he write that? Well, let's start by asking, what would it have meant if he wrote forte? What would it have meant if he wrote mezzo forte, mezzo piano, fortissimo? Why would you choose those words? How is it different? So why did Elgar why did he make the upbeat that way? I mean, it's not just by accident. So what is in there in the language? So look, I mean, it's a lifetime of study, but what we don't want to do is just imitate what we heard on a recording, because that gets us into kind of a bad game of telephone where we just keep repeating, you know, our interpretation becomes an exaggeration of someone else's interpretation. I mean, for all that we can learn listening to other players from the golden era, from the modern era, from everything that we can learn, it's still, that's that's like a child learning a language. You still have to make your own sentences. You have to speak your own ideas. There's a famous story of Heifetz throwing a student out, like firing him as a student because a student came in with a perfect imitation of him. And he said, I have no interest in this. You know, you have to find your own way. That's my property. You have to make your own. But it's made up by understanding how you learn to write, you learn to speak by listening and reading how everybody else writes and speaks, and understanding it, and not just, you know, getting beyond imitation, but getting to where does it come from. And that's, you know, that is understanding the score and understanding the language, understanding where it is. So I'm going to wrap up because I've been rambling for a long time, and I'm disappointed not to get any questions about opossums, but you know where to find me. Look, this is a particular passion of mine. It doesn't have to be the answer for you, but it has to be the question for you, if that makes sense. It's 100% okay to come to your own conclusions, but not based just on ignorance, not based on not knowing what's out there, not based on not understanding the difference, because you have this incredible wealth that's a gift to you that can help you in your own education, in your own understanding, that can help you make your choices. And this is, as I said, this is what makes the work of being a musician worth it. To try to, I mean, the moments when I'm practicing and I find a way to make a phrase better, I understand something clicks in, and I realize why this phrase I've been doing for years is clunky and it didn't work, and I suddenly, wait a minute, here's what if I move it this way, you know, Eike August, who's a pianist, and by the way, I asked them to, Eike August was Heifetz's last pianist, and she's coming here to Houston. We're doing a couple of concerts which will be live streamed on March 6th and March 9th. And I think William's very kindly going to put those links up if you want to join us for those concerts. And again, I'm playing with her because I'm trying to learn more about this style, trying to understand more about this world. But, and I've forgotten how I launched into this story about her. But this is our work as a musician. And I hope that your work and your life will be as rewarding as mine has, because this is what makes it worth it. To play the cello well is meaningless, but to make beautiful music is almost infinitely meaningful. So I wish you all the best and hope to see you in real life sometime soon. Be safe, be well.